Yes. All right. Well, thanks so much for being interested in this session. Glad to have you here. I'm gonna, let's see, do I have sharing rights? Can I get sharing rights, Rebecca?
Of course. Here you are. Sorry about that. Let's see.
Yeah, no worries.
Co-host. There you are.
Awesome. Yep, perfect. Thanks. Okay. Alrighty. Well, since we are talking about survey development, we're going to start out with the survey. So we really want to just get a sense of why you all are here and what you're interested in learning through this session. So, and you're seeing okay, I'm switching that. Okay, there you go. That's better. I'm going to go ahead and put a link in the chat. And then if you will go to that link, it'll ask you this question. What are you hoping to learn through this session? So let me, of course, I'm gonna have to stop sharing for just a minute because I need to get the link. Okay, there we go. Back to Zoom. Okay, so I just put a link in the chat. So if you'll click on that, it's just gonna ask you that question of what you hope you're gonna learn today. And then we'll take a look at those responses and then hopefully, and then we'll kind of morph our presentation as needed and make sure we address those things. So I'll give you just a minute to do that, and I'll keep track of the responses. Okay, great. Looks like we've got a few responses in. So just so Nathan knows too what they are, everyone else. So learning how to create an effective and efficient survey, and we'll definitely be talking about that. Similar to create an effective survey tool, we're giving some tips today on developing survey tools. And then the last one is an interesting one that we hadn't thought about talking on, but we can definitely address that. So it's how to best and legally capture data and outcomes with food security programs. So this is great for us to have kind of a sense of what you're hoping to gain from today's presentation. And if you have questions, during the presentation, feel free to either unmute yourself and ask, or you can put it in the chat box. We're happy to make this more interactive, and we have some places in our presentation that will be interactive, but you can definitely interact with us that way as well. So Nathan, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Do you want me just to share the slides?
Yeah, why don't you just share them and you can advance them?
And then I'll just advance them for you.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. Display settings, of course. Okay, there we go.
All right, so what we wanted to first talk about, and this sort of addresses some of the comments about putting together a survey. We think it's really important when you get started with survey research, to ask a few really important questions before you get started. So we'll just go over each one of these, and like Rickelle said, if you have any questions, please shoot it in the chat or just unmute and ask as we go through this. So I think one of the first questions it's important to ask is, what is the overarching purpose of your survey? It's really important to ask this question and to understand what is it that you are trying to accomplish. Rickelle and I are often doing this with official research at the university that we need to have published, and I often don't do what I should in terms of this question. And it's really important to kind of stop for a minute and say, okay, what do I really want to accomplish? Because that understanding what the overall purpose of your survey is really going to help you to be able to develop the right questions, to use the right survey format, which are all things we're going to talk about through the remainder of this presentation. So it's really important to identify, first of all, what is that purpose? Second of all, you need to understand who is your target audience. Who is it that you are going to be gathering the data for? So there's really kind of two target audiences, I guess. First of all is, who are you asking the question to? Who are you getting the information from? And then the next bullet point there to think about is, who are you going to disseminate your results to? Who is it that wants to know the information? Are you doing it just for your own purpose? Are you doing it for the purpose of disseminating it to other people, to publish a manuscript, or to just understand better, to present to their university, or whatever it might be. So consider who you're getting the information for, who are you going to ask the questions from, and then who are you going to disseminate the information to. And again, both of those also will have an effect, as you'll see through the presentation, on the types of questions that you're asking. Just a quick example, obviously, if you're collecting data from students in kindergarten, the questions are going to be written different than if you're asking high schoolers or even college-age students, right? The way you write the questions, the way you word the questions will be different depending on who your audience is. And then I think a really important question we have to kind of stop for a second and ask is that last one is a survey even appropriate? I think we frequently get in the mindset sometimes that if I want to get information from a whole bunch of people, I'm going to do a survey. And we'll talk about different ways of doing surveys, and they're actually quite easy and very available today. So I think we often kind of just jump to that conclusion that I'm going to do a survey to get my information, but there really might be a better way. And we'll talk about a couple other methods later on of different ways to gather some of that information that's not in the form of a survey. So understanding whether or not this is actually the best tool is also important to think about when you get started.
Okay, so maybe before I go into designing your survey, I'll just make a comment here related to the question asked about the legalities of collecting data, because from this point on, we're really going to be talking more about design of a survey and analysis of the data that you gather. I think one thing that's important to understand or think about is how you're going to be using the data that you're collecting. So I kind of feel like it would be nice to know a little bit of, if you wouldn't mind, those that are that are here in the session, just to have a sense of what your background is, or what your position is, or are you running a program? Are you a student? Are you faculty? You know, kind of just what maybe a little bit just a sense of where you're coming from. I'm hoping if you want to put it in the chat, that would be fine if you prefer to do that over verbal. But if someone's willing to share, if you'll just unmute yourself. Maybe no one wants to go. Maybe Sean, would you be willing to kind of give us a little bit of?
Sure, and I had that last question of the collecting data legally and trying to gauge more of the outcomes of our food security program. So I'm the director of the Center for Community Engagement at Utah State University, and we're just trying to I think figure out how we best track our impacts for our food security programs long term, so that we can always kind of make a good case that the funding that we get from the university, the funding that we raise, is well justified. And to do that, I think we're in the tough position of trying not to compromise, make uncomfortable any of our patrons of our food security programs, and making sure that we're, not making any more barriers to our services when we definitely, especially during a pandemic, we don't need to be doing that.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing, Sean. I really appreciate it. And I see Brooke and Paige put in there. So Brooke, your new registered dietitian on UC campus, creating an entirely new program for multiple populations. Okay, you want to track data. Okay, that's good to know. Okay, and then Paige, you're a graduate student at University of Utah. Great. And then you're creating a survey. Okay, great. So that just gives me a little bit of context of where you're coming from. So I'll just quickly mention the whole thing without legality. Really what it comes down to is how are you going to be using the data that you're collecting from your sample. So if you're using it for improvement in your program internally, like at Utah State or wherever you might be, if you're using it internally, or even if you're putting it to the administrators in your unit or your organization, university, where you're at, really in that case, you probably, or in that case, you really don't need to think about going through like an institutional review board for human subjects, because you're using it more internally. But it's when you start thinking about, we want to disseminate this to to outside of our university, or maybe to like research publication or something broader, then you might have to start thinking about and working with your institutional review board at the university or organization where you're at, where all of your university. So you'd use it at your university to make sure that when you're collecting the data, that the individual you're collecting it from have consented to be able to respond. Now, obviously, in any kind of research, especially with food insecurity, where it is so sensitive, and like you said, Sean, because of the pandemic, and even with college students, I think there's still a little bit of a stigma there, that we've got to really make sure that they know that the data we're collecting, we're not going to do it in a way that's going to be identifying. And so even if you're doing internal and don't need to go through the institutional review board, I think it's really important that right up front, that on a survey, that you let individuals know, hey, your responses are going to be anonymous. We're going to group these together, and we're not going to do report it in any way that's going to be identifiable. So, but the legality really just comes in with how you're disseminating it. And if you ever have questions on that, definitely reach out to your institutional review board, tell them what you're interested in doing, and then they will let you know whether or not what you're planning to do is under the scope legally of the federal regulations for human subjects research. Dr. Stokes, do you have any other comments? Nathan, do you have any other comments that we'd add?
No, I think that's great. Like I said, depends on how you're wanting to disseminate it. And I think working with your IRB, your institutional review board, from our experience, they're not going to let you do something. They're always happy to help, and they're not going to let you do something that you're not supposed to. So if you ever have any questions, that's a great resource to go to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now let's move into this portion of the presentation, which is about designing your survey, which is, I think all of you are interested in having some information about this. So there are different types of survey types that you can do. When thinking about this presentation, knowing that we're talking about food insecurity, and primarily we're talking about with college students, probably the most feasible would be to do a written or an online survey. You can do telephone, but these days telephone's like, how do you get some people's cell phone numbers? But if you for some reason did have someone's cell phone, or a group of students' cell phone numbers, then that is a possibility to do text messaging. That's probably more common than people wanting to be on the phone, like telephone answer, but that is another possibility. But I'm guessing that most of you are probably thinking about doing either a written paper type survey or an online survey. And probably you would say, so Nathan and I experience working with college students, because they're so tech savvy, and most of them have access to a smartphone, or even if they don't have a smartphone or a computer, because not all students do, they have access on campus to a computer. So online tends to be probably more commonly done in college students, but it doesn't mean you couldn't do a paper one. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those, some tips for doing, based on my experience, tips for making effective written paper surveys and effective online. And we're going to do some activities with online especially. So this is just my summary slide of thinking about effective written kind of paper surveys, what things you should consider when writing them. And I'm going to show you an example. One is, it's always good and this first bullet point is actually useful for any survey, whether it's telephone, online, text, whatever it might be, paper, is to actually have a statement that tells the respondent or the survey taker, this is what the content of the survey question is going to be about. I'm going to be asking you about X, Y, or Z. Now, sometimes we have to be careful, because you could say in your mind, you might be thinking, oh, we could tell them we're going to ask them about food insecurity. But not a lot of people know what food insecurity means who don't do research or are in the area where we talk about food insecurity. So sometimes we have to kind of describe it in layman's terms rather than like the official definitions. The second thing is just make sure that your font is large enough for an audience. Now, college students, probably not as much of an issue unless they have some kind of vision impairment. But when we start talking about audiences like older adults, where they typically do have visual impairments, then we have to think about, is a font size too small for them to read? So this is something to think about when you're developing surveys. The other thing is spacing on the page. If you're doing a paper survey, you don't want to have to the 0.5 margins, text everywhere. It needs to look visually like it's not overwhelming. So you want to have text that's not crowded on a page. Some of these might seem intuitive, but it's helpful to number each question just because it kind of helps the person logically go through the survey. And then also, I'll just mention here the last bullet point. Another reason for numbering is sometimes you may have a branching question where maybe they answer yes or no on a question, and then how they answer takes them a different route on the survey. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. So having a number there, you can say, if you answer no, go to question 3 rather than question 2. And then the other thing is just making sure you provide clear instructions for the respondents. So are they supposed to circle the response, check the box, or what does that look like? So here's an example. This is from the National Cancer Institute, and this is their dietary screener questionnaire. So this is a very specific survey. This is a food frequency questionnaire, but I like it because it shows an example of some of the things it's talking about. So for instance, you have here is telling you what this survey is about. So it says, these questions are about foods and then so on. And then here is telling you use an X to indicate your answer. So it's giving instructions of how to do that. This one, and then it's showing you here, you can see on question 3, if you mark never, it's telling you go to question 4. So you bypass 3A and 3B and just go to 4. So this is this is that example of like how to make sure that you have clear survey flow so they know what they're expected to do on the survey. Does anyone have any questions about, that's pretty much all I'm going to cover with written surveys, like paper surveys. Anyone have any questions about that? And if you do, maybe just type them in the chat and we can get back to those in a minute. Okay, so online surveys, which is probably most of you are thinking about doing some kind of an online survey. There are more than these 3, but these are the 3 I have used. So Qualtrics I've used the most. I have the most experience with that. And then Google Forms, I just started using in the classroom this semester, actually. So I have a little bit of experience there. And then SurveyMonkey I've used with their professional organization. So I have some experience there as well. And we're just going to go through and we'll talk about these. Actually, here's my interaction. So here's a QR code. And if you don't have a QR code or a reader, I can also put it in the chat, but I can't figure out how to, let me see. There we go. Okay. I have to get coordinated on Zoom. I'm going to put the link in the chat too, just in case you don't have a QR reader. And then it's going to ask you a series of questions. So if you'll just take a minute to look at that and answer those, it'll be great. I'm wondering if there's going to be a delay, and if you can just give me a thumbs up emoji when you finish, then I'll kind of know, okay, there's just a delay in it coming through. Okay. Because I have had this, okay, great, everyone's done. I'm going to move on and then I'll come back to this. We can look at the results later, because sometimes I've done this in class before too, and for some reason with Qualtrics it doesn't come through immediately. Okay, so let's move on and then we'll come back to that. choosing an online platform, one thing I would say is if I'm guessing Utah State are some kind of an online survey platform. So I would say whatever you have access to at your university, that's what I would use if you want to do an online survey. And the reason why is because of the second bullet point. Free versions of at least of Google Forms and Qualtrics and SurveyMonkey, they all have limitations in what they offer. Google Forms in general just it's probably I would say it's good if you're okay with the respondent seeing all the questions at once. But if you have any kind of branching, Google Forms won't do that. So if you want to have some more sophisticated kinds of questions, like in the survey you took where I asked if you had experience with online, if you'd ever completed an online survey before, yes, no, it branched you to different questions based on your responses. So in SurveyMonkey and Qualtrics, you can do that kind of sophisticated survey flow so that respondents only see questions are relevant to them based on what they're responding, or like how I'm not familiar with Google Forms having a paid version, but Qualtrics and SurveyMonkey do. And so the free versions of SurveyMonkey and Qualtrics, they limit how many people, well, some of them allow you to have as many people as you want, but they limit how many responses you can see. So that doesn't make any sense, So essentially you're limited to how many you can reach. It can be, 20 to 40 to 50 to 100, somewhere in there. Whereas if you're wanting to sample a larger number, then it's better, it would ideal to be able to have a subscription. And then also, I already mentioned Skip Logic. And then if you want to use a QR code or email or some other type of feature to disseminate it outside of a link, then that also in some of these platforms requires a subscription. But I'm guessing the universities you're at have that capability. All right, so our next thing we're going to do is actually for you to see what a Google Forms survey looks like. So this is my trivia time. So we haven't talked about anything in this session about what types of questions are out there. There are two different kind of classifications of questions. So I'm just going to throw this to you and do your best guess at answering these. So I'll put the link in the chat again, and then you'll get to see what a Google Form type survey looks like. And I have the survey questions up on the screen, but the Okay, great. We'll again look at that data a little bit later. So now I just want to take you through these questions just briefly. So this first one is actually closed-ended with ordered or scaled choices. So anything that you see where it has anchors, usually they're like a never to always, or it could be a strongly agree to strongly disagree, or like the one you saw, I had very confident to not at all confident. So anything where it has kind of that all or none kind of framework, we call that a Likert scale. And those are a scaled or ordered choice. Now this one, I will say this, these questions aren't written very well, is what I intentionally they're not written well. So maybe you notice that when reviewing them. I just want you to maybe, if you have ideas or a thought of what you think is not so great about this question, you can just put it in the chat if you want. or you can, chat's kind of what you've been using, so we'll just use the chat. And that's okay. I'll just, we'll just, oh wait, okay. Choices are not numbered. Okay, that I could see that. It'd be easier if you could have numbered choices. That could be helpful. The other problem with this one is really the stem of this question. So when we were actually write survey questions, right, leading question. And when we write questions, we have to be careful that we're not trying to bias the response to go in the direction we think it should. So this question actually reminds me a lot of political surveys that I get from different, of different organizations that are like, don't you think that happening is a bad thing? And you're like, okay. So this one, we're kind of telling them, we're giving an opinion about junk food that is poor quality, it's high fat and sodium. And that's a negative thing. And then you're saying, how often do you do this negative thing? Well, usually people might be inclined to not want to say they do a negative thing. So you're biasing or leading them to answer a certain way. So be really careful that we keep it much more general and not so in a way that we're trying to get a certain answer. They feel inclined to give a certain answer. And we'll talk about in a minute, Nathan will talk about how do you know if what you've written actually is doing that. And he'll talk more about how you test the questions. Okay, this next one is also a closed-ended with scaled choices. This one's a little bit different though, because now we're asking about quantities, but there's still kind of a ranking, I guess you could think of, it's progression. So this one, anyone have a thought on what is wrong with this one? You're like, what? I didn't come for a test. This one is overlapping. This is super easy to do. If you look at this, if you consumed one serving, where do you put your response? Because it actually, you could either put it in the first answer, which is one or less servings, or you could put it in the second one. So this is where you have to be really careful that each of these are what we call mutually exclusive, so that you don't have something where someone can respond in one or more categories. But therefore, if you have it like this, your data is not reliable. And so you wouldn't be able to use the question. This, I'm telling you, this is easier to do than you think, because I've even, after years of experience, I've even had times where I'm like, wait a minute, we have an overlapping question. Like, no, you can't have that. So just have to be really careful when writing things with numerics. Okay, this next one is a partially closed-ended. Partially closed-ended just means that anytime you add an other option and have them specify something, this would be, it's partially closed-ended because this is an open-ended. Free text response would be an open-ended. This one, the problem here, this one may not be as obvious, is it's undefined. So using terms like healthy foods, you have to decide when you're developing a survey whether or not you want to define a term like healthy foods, or whatever term it might be that could be interpreted differently by people, or if you really want to leave it up to the interpretation of the individual. Nathan and I are working on a survey now where we have something like healthy foods in our survey, but we had this long conversation about whether or not we need to define it. And if we do, how do we define it? Is it okay if it's left up to the perception of the participant? And I think in the end, if you want them to think of something a specific way, you have to define it for them so that they know, oh, okay, I'm supposed to be thinking about this term in this way. Even if I normally might think about it some other way, they want me to think about it this way. Helps you have better consistency in how you're interpreting your findings, so that when they answer, you are knowing that their response is related to how you've defined this phrase. This one, if we took off the other option, this would actually become what's called a closed-ended with unordered choices. So essentially, these are all no free text response answers, and none of these are they're all equally the same. Like it's not ranking from one end to another end of a spectrum or ordered by numbers. They're just categories. So when they're just general categories, this would be unordered choices. And then this one is a closed-ended with dichotomous choices. So dichotomous meaning two. So just a yes, no. And then this one, I'll just say it here. This one is what's called a double-barreled question. So this one is sometimes you may have something in a question where you have an and, like this one, fruits and vegetables. Now, if I didn't care how they responded, like if I didn't want to distinguish between whether or not they ate fruits and whether or not they ate vegetables, I just cared collectively, then this maybe isn't a problem. But if I wanted to know how many, like if they eat fresh fruit daily or if they eat vegetables daily, well, I wouldn't be able to tease that out with this one question because I don't know, maybe they eat vegetables, but they don't eat fruit, or they eat fruit and they don't eat vegetables, but I don't know from this question. So this is really where you have more than one subject is covered. You know, one thing I'm just quickly thinking, let me go back. I didn't talk about some of the benefits and some of the, let me just quickly mention. So some of the things with scale choices, the advantages of using this is you do have wider range of responses. So people feel like they can find their answer. Here, what can be challenging, this one doesn't show this option, but sometimes and I strongly disagree to strongly agree. The center rank, like right in the middle, could be a neither agree nor disagree. And if somebody marks that, you really don't know, you don't have, it's kind of neutral. What does neutral tell you? It may not tell you very much. And so that can be a challenge with scaled. Okay. I'll just mention this one. Servings is challenging for people. If you're looking at dietary, this is hard for people to understand what a serving is, but that's kind of a secondary thing here. With partially closed-ended, one of the things that I find as a challenge with other, please specify, is sometimes people will mark other, but they won't write anything in the box. So you have no idea what they were meaning by other. So that can be a challenge. And then a challenge with yes, no is that, I don't know if you've been in a survey before where you wanted to mark maybe or sometimes, but you only have yes, no, and you're very limited. And so you maybe are answering how you don't really feel, but you just have to answer one of those. So that can be a challenge with using yes, no, but it is simple and it's easy to analyze because there's only two categories. Sorry, I wanted to talk about that. Oops. Okay. And then this is the first one you did earlier, which is an open-ended question where it's just simply free text response. One of the benefits of using an open-ended question on the survey is you get more specific information from their experience and they get to free write it from their own experience. The challenge with this is with analysis, and Nathan's going to talk more about analysis with open coding, but that's where it becomes more time consuming and it takes a little bit more effort to code or to analyze an open-ended question on a survey. Okay, that's you.
All right. First of all, are there any questions yet on the questions and writing questions before we move on? Anybody? Think of anybody, throw them in the chat and we can certainly talk about them now or later. But so now we're going to move on and kind of talk about the next step. So after you've decided which type of survey you want to do, you've looked at your questions, you've got your questions written, it's important to test your survey. And this is a big step that even as I became a researcher and went through that I didn't understand. I'd been in many classes and I'd put together surveys for class projects and then my PhD mentor was like, well, we have to do testing the survey. I'm like, what do you mean test the survey? The survey's fine. I just wrote all these awesome questions. I'm going to get all the answers I want. Like, what do you mean? And so there's a couple different types of testing, validity and reliability. I'll just mention a couple things quickly with reliability testing. This is we use to verify that the content of the survey is accurate and reliable. And so that this is really typically accomplished mostly through advanced statistical methods and things. So even as, Rickelle and I, as we do lots of survey research, we don't often do reliability testing a lot. We do sometimes, but so we're not really going to focus much on that other than saying that is a way to kind of test the content that what you're looking at is actually accurate. What is very common and I think very applicable to this sort of the type of population that we would be looking at with food insecurity and college campuses and those types of surveys is what we call validity testing. This is what Rickelle kind of mentioned earlier. This is how we can know and we can kind of catch when we write bad questions. And we can make sure that the questions that we've written make sense to the participants. There's several different ways of validity. The two that are most applicable that we'll talk about today are what's called content validity and face validity. So content validity is when we use an expert panel to look at our survey. So we develop it, we write questions, and in terms of it was for food insecurity, we would then talk about, okay, who are some experts in food insecurity that know a lot about this topic area that could look at our survey, read through the questions, and they're actually going to tell us, is the question phrased correctly? Is it understandable? And is it appropriate? Is the content matter appropriate for the topic of food insecurity? And they would rate it on a scale of 1 to 10 on those things. And so this is kind of really looking at, is the content of my questions appropriate, right? Are they related to food insecurity and so forth? And then the next one we'll talk about is face validity. And what we typically do for face validity, I always think of it's face because you're looking at the face of the survey, the way it reads, the way the questions read, the flow of the survey. And we typically use, now I just lost this phrase. You want to go to the next slide, Rickelle? So we do cognitive interviews is what we typically use for this. And so again, this is where we really can test those questions and make sure that they make sense to whoever it is that we're going to ask the questions to. So the way a cognitive interview works, we've got several bullet points here. The way it works is, and the first thing to point out that's important is, it sounds kind of intimidating. Maybe I remember when I first heard about cognitive interview, it sounded really complex. And even as I describe it, it might, but it's really not. It's a very simple process, and you don't have to do it to a lot of people. It's very small sample size. You typically only need a handful of people, anywhere from 3 to 10, but you can get away with a small survey on a college campus. 3 or 4 cognitive interviews is probably sufficient for a lot of the things that you would be doing. So the way it works is you have a couple people in the population. That's really important. It needs to be the people that you're actually going to ask the questions to. So if you're wanting to learn from college students, you need to actually find college students to do the cognitive interview. You don't want to get a faculty member or mom or dad at home to test it. You want somebody who's actually in the population. So that's first of all. And then you simply have an interview with them. We do them, you can do them in person, but due to COVID, I almost now with my research, almost exclusively do them through Zoom. It's just easier for the participant not to have to meet us on campus somewhere, and we just do it over Zoom. So you set up a Zoom interview with this person, and the purpose of this is not to actually have them to gauge their understanding of the topic, but to have them help you understand your questions better. So the way they do it is they take the survey, and as they take it, they talk out loud about their thought process, which sounds kind of weird. And when you've never done one before, it is a little weird, but after the first few minutes, it's not weird anymore. So I think but they actually just talk out. I'm actually working on some of these right now on a project. I had a couple of research assistants this morning do some cognitive interviews. And so they would literally say, okay, question number 1, what is your, agree to strongly agree, do you eat fruits and vegetables every day? Right. And then they say, well, I think about this question. I think, well, I had fruit for breakfast this morning, but I don't usually have vegetables. And so I would have to say, I would select strongly disagree or whatever it might be. So they just verbally talk through their thought process. And that allows us to see and catch some of those mistakes that Rickelle talked about. They might say, well, you asked me about fruits and vegetables. I only eat fruits, so I don't really know how to answer the question because there's no option for only fruit. And you go, oh, wow, okay, yeah, that's great. That's a good comment. You write that down and make a note. You can adjust that later. And so some of those other bullet points here, explain what they interpret the questions to mean. So as they talk through their thought process, they'll kind of, well, I think the question means this. And you may all of a sudden be going, oh, wow, I didn't know you would interpret that. They're interpreting this question completely different. I've had many experiences where I write a question and we've looked at that question and Rickelle's smiling because it happens all the time. And we've had a whole group of very experienced researchers working on questions and writing it just the right way. And we think we finally got it just right. And then we actually give it to the students who are going to take this survey. And they're like, that makes no sense. I don't understand that question. I don't know how to answer it. And so then we can say in that cognitive interview, you can say, well, how could we word it better? What word would make more sense to you than that word? And they can say, well, I think it would make more sense if you worded it this way or if you did it that way. So that kind of helps us get at, again, making sure those questions are interpreted correctly by those who will be taking the actual survey. Let's see if I missed anything here. They can describe the difficulty in answering the questions and so forth. So let's see here. Yeah, and so then once we get through all that, looks like I've touched on all those, I think. And then you can, it's once you've done that, you can collect your data. And so then we're going to talk about now, how do we analyze data, right? So we've written the survey, we've got good questions, we've tested it. We adjusted our survey after the cognitive review. You go back and you adjust your questions based on the feedback from your expert and your cognitive reviews, and then you send it out and you collect your data, right? So now you've got this data, and now you need to analyze it. So I'm going to talk for just a minute really quickly about qualitative data, which is those open-ended questions, okay, in surveys. You can also have whole studies that are qualitative where you've done interviews. That's not really what we're focusing on today. But on those open-ended questions, if you just ask them to type in a sentence or two, what are your feelings about food insecurity? And you're going to have hundreds of responses and paragraphs that they've written about their opinions of food insecurity. So those types of questions are beneficial because they help us to understand participants, how they view this topic. And it can help us understand their feelings, to understand better where they're coming from, rather than just having them choose from some selected options. So when you have paragraphs of information rather than numbers, like you would have from a survey, you analyze the qualitative data by, first you have to familiarize yourself with the data. So you would read through all the responses that they gave you about their thoughts on food insecurity, just like you're reading a book. You just read through all of it. You kind of code it, you start to break it apart, and you look at it and say, okay, there seems like there's some themes coming up here. The students continually talk about how they don't have access to a food pantry, and that's really difficult for them. And so you code those, and that becomes, and eventually the idea is you develop overarching themes. So maybe from your open-ended questions about their opinions of food insecurity, there's 3 themes that come out that they consistently talk about over and over again amongst all the students who participated. That would be your theme, and that's how you report the data, is through reading through it. You come up with themes through the method of coding and breaking apart the sentences and paragraphs into different codes which fit into themes. And then when you report the data, you say, okay, theme 1 is students are struggling with food insecurity, right? And then you have quotes from the students, things that they wrote down or typed in there that indicates why they struggle with that. So that's kind of again, qualitative data. We can have a whole nother hour-long or 2-hour-long session just on qualitative data. We just wanted to touch on it quickly. That if you do have those open-ended questions, that's sort of the basic method that you would go about analyzing those questions.
So I'm going to just briefly touch on quantitative analysis. And like Nathan said, really any of these topics we talked about, we're really just getting your feet wet in some of the areas, but really to know, like if what we talked about, like if you have more in-depth questions, we'll have some time for questions today, but if you have something come up later, you can definitely reach out to us. Just a very basic kind of overview of quantitative. Depending on the type of data you're collecting will really determine what kind of analyses you would do. The simplest and the most maybe straightforward is just doing what are called descriptive statistics. So looking at frequencies, so counts or percentages and means. And I just wanted to just let you know ways that you can manage data responses in each of those platforms that I mentioned today. So Qualtrics, note that Qualtrics and SurveyMonkey, the features for downloading the data are really based on with a subscription. So Qualtrics you can download in lots of different formats. The ones that I've used most commonly are Excel and SPSS. So if we're using SPSS is a statistical packages for social scientists. So it's a statistical software. Some of you maybe have used it before. Excel, sometimes I work with a statistician on campus and he uses SAS. And so for that, he needs an Excel file. And sometimes I've just done some analysis in Excel, some basic analysis. I probably should have put SurveyMonkey next to that one just because they're very similar. So SurveyMonkey, you can also download into Excel, SPSS, and other formats, kind of like Qualtrics. That actually has changed over time. SurveyMonkey used to not be as robust. It's actually changed, which is good. I'm glad to see that. Google Forms, you can download to an Excel, but that's really the extent there. And then finally, with doing a written or paper survey, this one is where it takes a little bit more time because if you have it in paper format and you want to do some kind of a meaningful analysis, you're going to have to transfer that paper format into something that is electronic, unless you want to do math by hand, which more power to you if you want to go that way. But putting it into like a Google Sheet or Excel spreadsheet manually. But then when you do things manually, it's always good to like do it twice or have 2 people do it or do a quality check just to make sure that you haven't done data entry error. That's the one challenge with doing a written survey is that it just takes a little bit more effort to be able to transfer that data in time than if you do it just online to start with. And I think because we're talking about college population, like I said, I think online is not anything foreign to college students. So in some ways it makes sense. However, I will say, having said that, if you're in a situation where maybe you have a comment box or a feedback box, a physical box, and for you, it makes sense that in that case, you want to have a written survey and have them drop it in a box, then anyway, you obviously can do that, but then you have to manually enter it in to do any kind of analysis. There definitely are more sophisticated analyses, and you can start splitting out your data by like thinking about food insecurity. Maybe you want to do something with food insecurity and food secure students and compare. In that case, you're going to have to use more sophisticated analysis than just a descriptive statistic, because you want to do comparison between two groups. I would say though, if you, what you end up doing is really depend on your background and experience with statistics. If you don't have a strong background in that, I would encourage you're on university settings, partner with statisticians on your campus who either if it's through public health or if it's through the statistics department, to see if they'd be willing to collaborate with you on doing an analysis if you want to do something a little bit more complex, as a way for them to give back to the campus. Obviously, people have to have buy-in, but those partnerships can be really valuable. And especially, I would say, if you're doing it more for a research setting, like if you are wanting to publish, then I think there's even bigger buy-in, because then that statistician can have their name on the paper as well. I mean, you can negotiate that. And then also I have there too, just if you are wanting to do it for like a research study, you have to then think about too, what kind of a sample size of responses, how many responses do we need to have in order for it to be meaningful and to really be reflective of the sample, the target audience that we're looking at. I just wanted to quickly, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to just quickly show the results from our session here, just to give you a sense of what this looks like. Although I think most of you have used some kind of survey tools before. So let me just pull up the one from Qualtrics. You can see that here we can actually look at the reports, and you can get even a basic summary here of the frequencies, the descriptive statistics just within what they have through their reports function. And again, a lot of you have used most of these platforms, so that was interesting. And then here's where like you can go into data analysis. It might take a minute, but you can actually export the data there. And then I just wanted to show you from the Google Forms, this is where you would download it into Excel. So it does at least offer that. I was actually pleased with that. Like I said, I just started using Google Forms this semester, and I've only used it in class. So I usually just show the distribution like this, but you can see that here again, we have some nice graphs. So I think it really just depends on what your end goal is. Like Nathan had said earlier, who are you disseminating these results to? What kinds of graphics do you want to have? What kind of analysis or approach do you want to take based on what your goal is for the survey? Oops, let me share my screen again and just end by saying thank you for your being here and for your attention. And if you have any questions, I guess we're out of time. But if you do have questions, you can definitely email us. Our email addresses are there. And thanks again.